Chicago's billion-dollar erosion problem is eating the shoreline alive. Not slowly, not subtly, gone in decades. Whole neighborhoods, iconic beaches, the foundation of the city's identity, vanishing into a lake that refuses to stop rising. This is the story Lake Michigan doesn't want you to know. And it's happening right now, beneath some of the most expensive real estate in North America. The water keeps rising, the shoreline keeps retreating, and nobody knows where it stops. Between January 2013 and July 2020, Lake Michigan rose nearly 2 meters. That's almost 6.5 feet of additional water where there was none before. Not a gradual creep over decades, a dramatic, unprecedented surge that drowned coastlines and unleashed destruction that Chicago is still scrambling to afford. In a single storm event in October 2019, a 15-foot bluff crumbled completely in just 12 hours. 12 hours. That's the speed of a catastrophe nobody prepared for. So where is this water coming from? Why now? Why Lake Michigan and not the other Great Lakes? And what does it mean for a city built on the assumption that the shore would always stay exactly where it was? The answer involves climate science, infrastructure built over a century ago, and a billion-dollar price tag that keeps climbing. This is the erosion story nobody saw coming until entire neighborhoods were already threatened. Picture this. You're standing on Chicago's famous lakefront, the place where the city meets the water, where families have built homes and businesses have operated for generations. The shoreline is iconic. It's Edgewater to the north with its tree-lined streets meeting sand. It's Rogers Park with its cozy neighborhoods built a stone's throw from the waves. It's Lincoln Park with its pristine beaches where thousands gather on summer weekends. The South Shore, where blue-collar families have built lives. The Grant Park Coast, where tourists and locals alike contemplate the endless expanse of water. The shoreline feels permanent. It feels like a boundary that has always been there and always will be there. But what if I told you that the literal edge of Chicago, the physical foundation of the city's lakefront identity, is eroding so fast that you can watch it disappear in real time? Not over generations, in years, in seasons. The crisis started quietly. Most people didn't notice when the water began rising in 2013. A few inches one year, a few more the next. The change was so gradual that people rationalized it away. Maybe it was just a wet year. Maybe the lake was experiencing a temporary surge that would reverse itself. By 2019, it was unmissable. Lake levels hit their highest point in 3 decades, climbing to 582 feet above sea level. Only 0.43 feet below the all-time record from 1,986. The lake that powered Chicago's expansion, that made the city possible, that seemed infinite and inexhaustible, was now coming back with a vendetta. Then came the storms. In January 2020, severe weather combined with those record-high water levels to unleash catastrophic damage. $37 million in property damage in a single month. Think about that number for a moment. That's enough to rebuild a neighborhood from scratch. That's enough to fund a city's schools for a year. That's enough to transform multiple communities. But $37 million is just the visible part of the iceberg. It's the repair bills, the sand replacement, the emergency stabilization work. The real damage, the property loss, the neighborhood degradation, the infrastructure collapse, the long-term economic impact, the reduced property values, runs much, much deeper. This was just 1 month, one catastrophic month. The water kept rising for years after. The water was relentless and unforgiving. It didn't stop in February. It kept rising through spring and summer and fall. Every monthly water level measurement broke the previous record. Beaches closed. Entire sections of the shoreline were cordoned off with emergency barriers and warning signs. People who had owned lakefront homes for decades watched as the ground beneath their property literally walked into the water. Not metaphorically. Actual bluffs, Dunes and protective barriers were dissolving in front of cameras and phones and terrified homeowners. The lake was eating faster than the city could repair. For every mile of beach that got rebuilt with sand trucked in from elsewhere, another mile was getting destroyed. It was a losing battle in slow motion. Here's where the story gets truly insane. Chicago's shoreline was protected supposedly by massive infrastructure built over a century ago. Between 1910 and 1931, the city constructed a system of wooden revetments, which are basically walls made of stone and wood that sit along the shore and break up incoming wave energy. It's brilliant engineering for its time. The design worked beautifully for decades. It protected the city. It allowed the lakefront neighborhoods to flourish. But by the 1950s, the wood piles began rotting from decades of constant water exposure. By the 1960s, chunks of the revetment were collapsing into the lake. By the 1980s and 1990s, the system was failing in sections. By 2019, massive sections were barely holding against normal wave action. Then the lake level surge happened, all at once. The lake rose to levels it hadn't reached in 30 years. The pressure on the old infrastructure became unbearable. Suddenly, those 100-year-old barriers were fighting an enemy they were never designed for. A lake that rose higher than it had in living memory. A lake that was angrier. A lake that was more energetic. The water pushed past the revetments, overwhelmed the protections, and started eating away at the bedrock and soil underneath. Entire beaches vanished. In Rogers Park, Howard Beach disappeared in a single season. Juneway Beach, the northernmost public beach in Chicago, was simply gone, closed, lost, inaccessible. What took decades to build, sand dunes, recreational infrastructure, the social infrastructure of community gathering, was erased in months. The emergency response was staggering in scale and urgency. The United States Army Corps of Engineers, the City of Chicago, and the Chicago Park District launched a coordinated emergency effort. They committed $500 million, that's more than $500 million, to reconstruct shoreline protections along 9 miles of beach spread across 24 different segments. Not all of Chicago's shore, not even most of it. Just the 9 most critical miles. Just the parts they could afford to save with emergency funding and federal grants. What makes this even more insane is that the $500 million project is replacing infrastructure that was already supposed to be permanent. They're doing this because the old system failed. But here's the terrifying part. Nobody can guarantee the new system will hold when the next surge comes. And climate science says the next surge will come. It's not a question of if anymore. It's a question of when and how severe. The cause of the lake's dramatic rise isn't a mystery or a secret. It's measurable. It's tracked by scientists. It's real. Between 2013 and 2020, Lake Michigan experienced unprecedented precipitation patterns. The Great Lakes region saw more rainfall and snowmelt flowing into the system than it had in decades. Most of this came from somewhere unexpected. Some was natural variability, a normal fluctuation in weather patterns that cycles through the region over decades. But a significant portion came from something else, a climate system that was warming up and holding more moisture. Here's the basic climate science explained simply so anyone can understand it. A warmer atmosphere can hold about 7% more moisture for every degree Celsius of warming. This is basic physics that meteorologists have understood for decades. This means that when it rains, it doesn't just rain a little harder, it rains a lot harder. When snow melts in spring, it doesn't just melt normally over months. It melts all at once, creating massive runoff in a compressed time frame. The Great Lakes Basin saw all of this compressed into a period that surprised even the climate scientists studying it. The precipitation records showed patterns that were outside historical norms. The data told a story that was impossible to ignore. Scientists studying the phenomenon found something deeply disturbing. The variability is getting worse. Lake levels aren't just rising gradually anymore, like they might in a natural fluctuation that cycles back and forth. They spike, they crash. They create the conditions for what used to be called 100-year floods and 100-year storms to happen every few years instead of every 100 years. This is what happens when you warm the planet and add more energy to the water cycle. The system becomes more volatile and unstable. The extremes become more frequent and more severe. The comfortable predictability of historical weather patterns disappears. Cities that planned based on what happened in the past are completely unprepared for the future. The research is conclusive and deeply concerning. Over the next 3 decades, Great Lakes water levels are projected to rise another 7.5 to 17 inches on average. That's enough to push the current crisis further inland, to submerge more beaches, to demand even more protection infrastructure. At the extreme end, the high-impact scenario that climate models suggest is plausible based on current emissions trends, Lake Michigan could see up to 80 centimeters more water. That's more than 2.5 feet. Additional, on top of what's already there, on top of the flooding and erosion the city just spent $500 million trying to fix. But here's what they didn't emphasize in the official reports and what most people don't understand. Even if the average water level stays the same, the storms will be worse. The surges will be more dramatic. The combination of higher baseline water with more extreme storm events will push the shore backward faster than any time in recorded history. A storm that would have caused moderate damage in 2010 becomes a catastrophe in 2030. The frequency of destructive events multiplies. What happened once in a century starts happening every 10 years. And the city's infrastructure, built for historical conditions, breaks under the new normal. The impact on Chicago's neighborhoods is already visible if you know where to look and what you're looking for. In Edgewater, beaches that existed for decades are now narrower. The soft sand is gone, replaced by hard-packed erosion damage and exposed bluff faces where the earth has been carved away by relentless waves. Residents talk about landmarks, a particular tree, a familiar rock formation, a distinctive beach access point that have simply vanished into the water. In Rogers Park, you can stand at the shore now and see pockets of land that dropped 15 feet during single storm events. You can walk to places that used to be completely inaccessible because they're now beach instead of bluff. The geography has literally changed. The psychological impact is hard to overstate. Residents watch their community literally crumble. They watch property lines shift. They watch the neighborhood they grew up in transform in real time. Some people develop a kind of ecological grief, a mourning for the landscape they knew. They remember where things used to be. Others are more practical. They're worried about their property values, their insurance costs, their ability to sell when they need to. Some people are making impossible decisions about whether to stay or leave. But the real cost isn't just psychological. Property values along the eroding shoreline are under significant pressure. Insurance companies are getting nervous about insuring homes on land that's demonstrably moving backward. Banks are starting to question whether mortgages on waterfront properties make sense when that water is coming closer every year. Some neighborhoods are facing a slow-motion property crisis where being lakefront, traditionally the most valuable address in any city, becomes a liability instead of an asset. The South Lakefront has suffered particular neglect in the recovery and protection efforts. While the more affluent North Shore neighborhoods get protection and restoration first, with better engineering and more funding, the Southside communities watch less funded projects lag behind. The disparity is stark and troubling. $74 million was requested from Illinois' Rebuild Illinois program to address shoreline erosion statewide. Chicago alone could use 5 times that amount just to bring the South Side to parity. The North Side gets the premium infrastructure and expert engineering. The South Side gets promised funding and emergency measures and delayed timelines. This creates a tier system of safety and investment that reflects existing inequalities. Richer neighborhoods with more political power and more valuable property get the billion-dollar infrastructure first. Poorer neighborhoods wait. Sometimes they wait for years. Everybody loses eventually, but some people lose faster and with fewer resources to adapt. The Army Corps of Engineers is running one of the biggest civil engineering undertakings in the city right now. The Morgan Shoal Revetment Reconstruction Project is happening in real time, replacing the century-old wooden barriers between the 45th and 51st Streets on the South Shore. They are using modern materials, better engineering, structures designed to handle wave energy and water levels that the original system never imagined. But it is slow, it is expensive, and it covers only a tiny fraction of the shoreline that needs protection. The strategy uses something called rubble ridges, literally rows of massive stone placed 500 feet offshore to dampen wave energy before it hits the beach. The water has to move over and around the rocks, losing energy and power in the process. When the waves finally reach shore after being broken up by the barrier, they are smaller, weaker, less able to carve away sand and soil. It is nature-based infrastructure meant to work with the environment instead of fighting against it. On paper, it is elegant and sustainable and beautiful. In practice, it is a race against time and against the rising lake and against the intensifying storms. The city also invested in a $1.5 million allocation from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for the Chicago Shoreline Storm Damage Reduction Project. That sounds like a lot until you do the math. When you are talking about protecting miles of urban shoreline and replacing 100-year-old infrastructure with state-of-the-art protection, $1.5 million is barely enough to start. It is enough for emergency repairs in a single neighborhood. It is enough for some new stone placement at critical points. It is not enough for comprehensive protection along the entire vulnerable coast. Here is what the Army Corps of Engineers will not say out loud, but understands completely. They cannot protect all of Chicago's shoreline. Not with current funding, not with current technology, not with current political will. They do not have the money. They do not have the time. The lake is moving faster than the solutions can be built. By the time the 9-mile protection project is finished, the south side beaches will already need the next round of work. The erosion is a permanent condition now, not a problem with an endpoint you can identify and work toward. The historical timeline is crucial to understanding how Chicago got to this crisis point. In the 1950s and 1960s, when Lake Michigan experienced its previous extended high water crisis, the city faced similar problems. Buildings were threatened by rising water. Infrastructure was at risk. The shoreline eroded backward steadily. The government response was massive and coordinated. The city, state, and federal government collaborated on a comprehensive shoreline stabilization project that cost over $300 million in today's money. It was a monumental engineering achievement, one of the biggest civil works projects ever undertaken in the region. And it worked. For decades, it held. The wooden revetments stopped the erosion. Beaches rebuilt naturally. The shore stabilized. People invested billions in lakefront real estate because they thought the problem was solved permanently. Chicago became defined by its relationship with Lake Michigan. Neighborhoods developed along the shore. Parks were built. The waterfront became the face of the city. Edgewater, Rogers Park, Lincoln Park, and the South Shore became desirable neighborhoods precisely because of their lake access. But infrastructure ages. The wooden piles rotted. The engineering grew obsolete. The design assumptions that worked for 50 years started failing after 70. The materials degraded. The foundations settled. The technology improved, leaving the old systems behind. And in 2013, the water started rising again. This time, faster than the previous cycle. This time with less warning. This time when the city had grown even more dependent on its shoreline as a defining feature of the metropolis. The cycle is now clear. Every 70 to 80 years, the the Great Lakes region experiences an extended period of high water. It causes catastrophic damage. Cities respond with massive infrastructure projects. Decades of stability follow. The infrastructure ages and fails. Then, just as that infrastructure nears the end of its designed lifespan, the cycle repeats again. But this time, it is worse. Because the baseline is higher due to climate change, the extreme events are more intense, and the protection infrastructure is fighting an enemy that is fundamentally different from anything in the historical record. The game has changed. If that just blew your mind, every subscriber is automatically entered in our monthly hoodie giveaway. Details are in the description. The future is written in the climate models, and it's not reassuring. As the Great Lakes continue to be fed by increased precipitation and basin runoff due to warming temperatures, water levels will oscillate more wildly than they have historically. Dry years will alternate with flooding years in a pattern that's becoming more extreme. But the overall trend points upward. The lake will, on average, be higher than it is now. The storms will, on average, be more intense. The combination will be brutal for any city built on a shoreline. What happens to a city built on the fundamental assumption of a stable shoreline when that shoreline is no longer stable? You get a cascade of interconnected problems. Insurance companies raise rates dramatically or stop offering coverage entirely. Property developers become cautious and nervous about investing in waterfront projects. Infrastructure investments become riskier and much harder to finance through traditional bonds and loans. Communities that have defined themselves by waterfront access start asking hard questions about their future viability. And the poorest neighborhoods, the ones with the least resources to adapt, the fewest safety nets, the weakest political voice, suffer first and most severely. Chicago has spent more than $1 billion preparing for a threat that's not going away. The $500 million protection project isn't the end of the investment. It's the beginning. In 10 years, when the lake rises another foot due to climate change and precipitation variability, the city will face demands for another expansion of protection, and another, and another. The bill will compound year after year, making it harder to fund other city priorities, harder to maintain existing services, harder to invest in education and infrastructure and transit. The budget gets squeezed until the city has to choose, which neighborhoods do we save and which do we abandon? That's the real story nobody wants to talk about. Not a one-time billion-dollar erosion problem. A multi-decade crisis with no endpoint, no final solution, no victory condition. Just endless adaptation, endless spending, endless compromise, and the slow realization that you cannot stop the lake. You can only delay its advance and pay more each year. The Lake Michigan erosion crisis is a warning message written in sand and stone and the property records of people losing their homes. It's telling us that our infrastructure isn't permanent. Our shorelines aren't stable. Our assumptions about the environment are breaking down. And every year we delay action. Every $1 billion we don't spend on climate adaptation and resilience, the problem gets exponentially harder to solve. Chicago will likely survive this crisis. It's a resilient city with tremendous resources and the economic power to adapt and persevere. But the survival will come at a significant cost. Higher taxes to fund protection projects, deferred maintenance on other critical infrastructure, political conflict over who deserves protection, neighborhoods forced to relocate or adapt, and communities permanently changed by the encroaching water. The shoreline you see today will not be the shoreline of 2050. It will be further inland. The beaches will be narrower. The park systems will be reshaped. The city will transform. This isn't an inevitable disaster that requires helplessness. It's a manageable crisis if we act now, if we invest in the right kind of adaptation, if we accept that some shorelines will be lost and plan accordingly. But the window for preventing the worst outcomes is narrowing. Every year of delay, every $1 billion we don't spend on climate adaptation makes the future darker and more expensive. The billion-dollar erosion of Chicago's shoreline is happening right now, in real time. Lake Michigan is claiming the land, and the story is far from over. The water will keep rising. The storms will keep coming. And the city will keep spending. And if this story is a reminder that disasters don't wait for permission or for us to get ready, download our free 72 Hours Disaster Guide. The link is in the description.